Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our forums are free and open to the public. Our mission is to nourish the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. For more information, go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today, I'm very happy and honored to present State Representative Donna Howard, and she's speaking on missed opportunities and misplaced priorities, a recap of the 84th legislative session. I'm just going to let her tell you all about that, but she has a real insider perspective. She's been Representative District 48 since 2006. As many of you know, she is a member of her church along with her husband Derek, and in fact she was president of our church at one point. She has a master's in health education from UT, and she's also a nurse who trained at UT, a critical care nurse, and she pioneered health education in Austin, hospital-based, and then was a health education instructor at UT. She's been a distinguished alumna of UT School of Nursing. She recently received Texas Women's Health Champion Award from the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She served on the Eanes School Board and learned a lot about politics there, and on many community boards such as the Texas Freedom Network, Common Cause, and the Austin Area Interreligious Ministries. She's now Vice Chair of the Higher Education and Appropriations Committee, a very important committee in our legislature, a member of the House Administration Committee, and she is widely known as a health policy and education policy expert. So let's give a warm welcome to Donna. She's so gracious to give us her time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you all for being here. I feel like I'm going to beam up in this gear on my head, so it's a little disconcerting, but I'm going to try to ignore it. This is a really great opportunity to be with you and to share with you my perspective on what happened in the most recent legislative session. Just to clarify a few things, I am currently the Vice Chair of Higher Education, and I am on the Appropriations Committee, not the Vice Chair there. I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that. I am on the article that looks at education, both public education, K-12, and higher education. And also on House Administration, as was mentioned. I think really the most important and most significant thing that I've been able to do is to be on the Appropriations Committee. It's just like anything else, where you put your money is what actually happens. And to be able to be on that committee and to direct some things, there's a lot, of course, as you might expect, that goes on behind the scenes. It's not necessarily what we do on the House and Senate floors. So it gives one an opportunity to insert things, to advocate for things, to try to prevent things. And with that, we had some successes, I'm glad to say. There were a lot of things that I wouldn't call a success, but we'll talk about some of that. I wanted to real quickly just go over kind of the basics of the legislative session, just to give a little perspective to what we're talking about here. You know that we have a part-time legislature, 140 days every other year. We have a almost $210 billion two-year budget that we approved. So we're considered by some, I guess the number can fluctuate a bit, to be the 12th largest economy in the world if we were a country. With that size of a budget, but a part-time overseer. I don't think any other business would run that way. I think it's a very strange situation that we have, but nonetheless it is what we have. Texas has prided itself on having a civic legislative body. Of course, this came about when you had to ride your horse from El Paso to Austin, which I don't think any of my El Paso colleagues do that now. So we probably could shift a bit how we do these things, but right now people are very keen on keeping us away from the Capitol. And lots of jokes out there about how, rather than meeting for 140 days every 2 years, we should meet for, how does that go, for 2 days every 140 years. There you go. That's it. I have to think about it. We have 150 House members and 31 Senate members, and those of us in the House represent about 175,000 people. The Senate has about 800,000 constituents that they represent. Right now, the makeup of the House is 98 Republicans and 51 Democrats. We did have 52, but one of our members resigned. There's going to be a special election for that San Antonio seat in the November election. There are 20 Republicans and 11 Democrats in the Senate. So clearly, we have a somewhat lopsided political body here. When I first got in a special election in 2006, and that subsequent election after that, we had 76 Republicans and 74 Democrats in the House. And I can tell you that when you have that kind of a breakdown, there's a lot more consensus building. There's a lot more of an effort to get things done because you have to appease a wider group of people. You're more evenly balanced. With the skewed kind of situation we find ourselves in now, you don't have that kind of opportunity sometimes. There's an opportunity to roll over people. And I don't think that's the best form of government. I'm not real happy about it. But one of the things we're stuck with is our redistricting process, which draws lines such that you're clearly in a Democratic or a Republican district, not much competition going on, and not much room for change within that 10-year period that those lines are in place. That's something we talk about a lot. That's something a lot of us have proposed legislation to change, but so far to no avail, because whichever party's in power wants to keep it that way. There's only about 20% of the representatives in both the House and the Senate that are women. This is another area that we have some work to do in. We had a few more women before the last redistricting occurred. Actually, it was before the 2010 elections. We got up to, I think, 24% representation, but we're back down to about 20%. So a lot of work there to do in order to have a more representative body. We had over 6,000 bills that were filed this session, and we ended up passing about 1,300 of those bills, which is kind of a standard thing, about 1 out of 5. And then the governor vetoed 43 of those. One of mine. This is the first time I've had one vetoed. And the one I had vetoed was actually apparently vetoed because of an amendment that someone else added to it. But the part that I was proposing and that I was very sorry to see be vetoed is something we've been working on for years here, and that is to allow the compensatory education dollars in public education, which are the dollars that are set up to help students who need additional resources, so-called at-risk students, but to help students who have ended up becoming pregnant and have chosen to keep their babies, wanting to stay in school. These dollars could be used to help pay for child care. At one point, the schools were given grant money to do that. That was taken away in the 2011 budget cuts. So we were trying to give them another option for funding that was already there, not an increase in the amount, just the ability to use already present dollars to help these students stay in school. And one would think in a legislative body that seems to want to make sure that no woman, including a young woman, including a teenager, has access to abortion, the encouragement is to keep the baby. Here are teens who are keeping their babies, needing to stay in school so they can become educated, they can get a job, they can support their new little family that they have here, and yet we couldn't get that passed in past sessions. We finally got it passed and then got it vetoed. So extremely disappointing to me. Bonnie referred to the title of my talk as Missed Opportunities, Misplaced Priorities. We probably could have also titled it, It Could Have Been Worse. Which is kind of a low standard, isn't it, to say for a legislative session? But quite frankly, just about every editorial that I read after the session ended basically said that it could have been worse. And we did, in my opinion, have a lot of opportunity, particularly with the budget that we squandered, and misplaced priorities in catering to a fairly a fairly low number of people who turn out for the GOP primaries but are dictating the agenda of what happens in the legislative session and getting focused on things that were not what most Texans care about. So we'll talk a little bit about that. just again for framing this, the legislature only has discretion over about 17% of our budget. The rest are federal funds or they're dedicated funds. In some way, they're tied to something, and we can't control that. So we're only talking about 17% or so of our budget that we actually can make a difference with in terms of the appropriation decisions that we make. We entered this session with a surplus from the previous session. And let me just back up a second to say that those of you that were around and recall, in 2011 we had a shortfall, and we ended up having significant cuts, including particularly to public education, with a $5.4 billion cut to public education in 2011. When we came back in 2013, we had some surplus dollars, and we made a little headway toward restoring some of those funds, but still did not restore those funds. It's interesting, I think, and the reason I'm bringing that up now is because when I said we came into this session in 2015 with another surplus, a fairly significant surplus, that's money we could have used in 2013 to plug more of those holes, but the legislative body as a whole chose not to do that. All told, though, what the comptroller told us when he produced our revenue estimate of what we'd have to work with this last session, we had $14 billion that would fall underneath our so-called pay-as-you-go constitutional amendment, and that's essentially a balanced budget amendment. So we had enough revenue projected coming in that we had, if we had the votes to do it, had $14 billion that we could have appropriated and kept us under the pay-as-you-go constitutional amendment. There's a more constraining amendment, though, that was at work there, and that is our spending cap. The spending cap was at $8 billion. So even though there was a total of $14 billion, we really were only dealing with, realistically, an $8 billion surplus we could work with. That $8 billion falls under the spending cap, and you can appropriate those funds without a special vote of the body. And most of us, I guess you pay attention to Congress, same thing here at the legislature. Most legislators do not want to vote to bust the spending cap, even if it's a responsible and appropriate thing to do. The way it's been framed is that is negative, even if it's necessary. So we had that to work with, plus, I'm giving you these big numbers because it is a lot of money we're talking about here, plus an estimated $11 billion to be in our rainy day fund, which is our economic stabilization fund. The economic stabilization fund was named that. We colloquially call it the rainy day fund, but the economic stabilization fund was created to help us ride the ups and downs of our economy. And it's been turned into something that's very sacrosanct, though, for whatever reason. And as we have gained more money in that fund, we've been less and less willing to spend any of it. It has grown from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, and we didn't spend one penny of it this session. So we came into session with all this money available to us, with all kinds of needs. We know we still hadn't fully funded public education. We hadn't restored to higher education. We hadn't expanded Medicaid, and we had a lot of health care bills that needed to be paid. We were still using funds that we were collecting from you for one purpose, not spending it on that purpose, but instead holding it back to balance the budget, billions of dollars that we were doing that with. We keep telling people that we need $5 billion more per year just to maintain current levels of congestion. We need more money in our transportation system. We came in knowing all these things, had all this opportunity with surplus to maybe actually, impact some of that. And I would suggest that we didn't anywhere near approach what we could have done. So the House budget, it rotates. The House does a budget one session, and the Senate leads off with the budget, but we both come up with our own budgets, and then at the end of the legislative session, those budgets are reconciled for our final budget. The House budget we worked on at the beginning of session, I'm actually pretty proud of. It could have been a lot better. It didn't have everything in it I wanted, but we worked very hard in a bipartisan fashion to come up with a budget that we had, I think it was 140 some odd legislators voted for it out of 150. That's pretty significant in that body. So we had a lot of good support behind it. We put an additional $3 billion into public education. We covered another $2 billion or so in enrollment growth. We put in another $1.5 billion in transportation. We put in about $500 million to increase the reimbursement rates for doctors, because part of the problem we have with access to care is the lack of providers with Medicaid. The reimbursement rates are so low, and don't let anybody tell you that that's the feds, that's us, that's the state that sets those reimbursement rates. The reimbursement rates are so low that we are losing providers. And so we put in enough money in there to get Medicaid rates up to the same reimbursement level as Medicare, which is still not where it should be, but it was a big step forward. And we were also looking at investing more money into pre-K, which we all know makes a significant difference in the success of our young people in this state. And we have a growing student population. Our demographics have shifted. The fastest growing cohort are those that are of most limited means and English language learners. So we wanted to invest in pre-K and pretty much had across-the-board support for that. Even the governor came out with that being one of his emergency orders. We put enough money in it to at least get us back to and above where we were prior to the 2011 cuts. Now, I'm rambling through all of that to tell you that we voted for that budget that had all of that in it, but that's not what came back to us. What came back to us in the final budget cut what we had proposed for public education in half, totally eliminated the $1.5 billion we were putting into transportation, even though every legislator over there will tell you that is a high priority. They cut that out. Cut the reimbursement rates, the increased rates for physicians, and reduced the amount of money that was going to be available for pre-K to where it's below still what it was before the 2011 cuts. That's what came back to us. And then in addition to that, added another $800 million for border security, even though we had many bipartisan hearings at the Capitol that indicated that we did not have good metrics, that we were getting mixed messages all the time, that the accountability was not there to justify this kind of an expense. But that was what came back to us. So there were 35 of us, I believe, that ended up voting against the budget. And I can tell you as an appropriator, when you put in all that effort to come up with a budget and you work very hard on getting something that will make sense, it's hard to vote against it. But it had been so changed with these major areas that we in good conscience didn't feel like we could support it. Of course, it did pass, and there were some good things in it, too. I don't want to just leave you with the impression that it was all a bad budget, because there are some good things there, and I'll mention some of those. But I do want to say, too, that the budget that came back to us left a bunch of money, so-called, on the table that could have been used for some of the things that I just mentioned were not in that final budget. You remember at the beginning I mentioned that we have a balanced budget amendment and a spending cap amendment that we have to meet. Within those two constitutional amendments, we had the flexibility, if we chose to use it, of another $6 billion. And we did not touch one penny of the $11 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund. We could have spent $3 billion of that without even having to have a special vote to bust the cap. And it was chosen not to do that. In addition to that, there was a $4 billion tax cut. Now, any of us would like to have a tax cut. There's nothing wrong with having a tax cut. Most of us would like to pay our bills before we cut the taxes, but, regardless, we'd like to have the tax cut. The tax cuts that were proposed, both of them, and you will be voting on one of these in November, both of them, the increased property tax exemption for homestead exemption for your school taxes, and then a tweaking of our business tax, both of those pots of money go into public education. So we're cutting two revenue streams that go into paying for public education. That's those tax cuts that we're talking about. And the only people that benefit, of course, from the property tax cuts are the homeowners. And the only people that benefit from that business tax are those that already pay it. So we're leaving out a whole lot of Texans that aren't getting any kind of a tax cut, and those that have a so-called average home, which I don't know that this is right anymore, but in the $200,000-something range, which in Austin is certainly not probably a current number, but would see something like $126 a year savings, which is nothing to sneeze at, but at the same time, when you're talking about not investing in things that will benefit all of us, it's something that you need to consider and talk about. So the other part of that, as I'm saying, is these revenue streams fund public education. The property tax cuts, the state's is supposedly going to make up that loss. It's about $1.2 billion. But as we know, in 2011, the state also had a promise to hold districts harmless from a previous tax cut and did not uphold the promise. So at this point in time, that's the promise. And let me also mention that with the final budget, even though we increased money to public education, 31% of the school districts in our state are still not getting what they got in 2011 prior to the cuts. 31%. We've had 2 legislative sessions where we have increased funding, and there are some school districts doing better than, which is great. We have an equity gap, and we're trying to decrease that equity gap. But in so doing, putting the money back in a different way than we took it out, some districts are benefiting, some are not. One who is not is the Austin Independent School District, which now has over 60% of its children on free or reduced lunch, which means that's our barometer for having poor kids. Over 60% of AISD students are poor. We're sending the largest amount back to the state in recapture. The amounts, I may have it here. I don't know if I do or not. Oh, I think it was, it's projected in 2016, the amount that's going to be recaptured and sent back to the state is something like $243 million. And in 2017, I think it's $273 million, something like that. Money that you are going to be contributing if you're an Austin Independent School District property owner. You will be contributing those dollars and sending a bunch of it back to the state so that the state gets off the hook if we're paying for some things for other districts. This district, which needs that money to invest in our growing population of children who need additional resources, we're losing that money. The system doesn't work. The system is out of whack. So another big issue that I have with the final budget that we got. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of good things that were in the budget. We did invest some more money in making our employee retirement system actuarially sound. That's a good thing. We haven't been doing that. We have not kept up with that. But there was a little bit of a trade-off there, too. We increased the state employee salaries enough to cover the increased contribution that they were going to have to make to this fund. So it's really a wash for the employees, but at least the fund is sound. We continued to try to buy down those diversions I mentioned a while ago. So when we were collecting a fund for one purpose but not spending it on that and holding it back to balance the budget, sessions back we had about $5 billion in that range. We bought that down by about $1 billion in the previous session and this session. So now we only have about $3 billion of your money that we're holding back to balance the budget instead of $5 billion. And you know, going in the right direction. We increased funding for higher education. We increased funding for tuition assistance. These are all good things. But with higher education, we're still below their high water mark by quite a bit. And with the tuition assistance, we're going to get to more students, or more students are going to be able to get these, but we've also decreased the amount of the award to each student. So we increased the pot, but we decreased the amount that goes per student so that they're getting less at the same time that the tuition and college-going costs are increasing. We also increased money for graduate medical education. We know we need more doctors. That's a big thing that we need in this state, and one of the holdups to that is not enough residency slots. So we increased those, another good thing. We increased money for women's health care. Still have some issues there. There was a consolidation of women's health care programs in the state this time, and one of the riders that I got put in the budget, it requires that the state have a stakeholder advisory group that helps them with that consolidation so that we can assure that women are going to get the services they need. Misplaced priorities. Let me real quickly just mention that I said earlier, we have the GOP primaries that are dictating a lot of what happens in the legislature, unfortunately. So rather than focusing on public education and transportation and water and those kinds of things that are going to help our communities be strong and keep us moving forward, we focused on abortion, on LGBT issues, and on guns. Don't think that that's what most people wanted us to focus on, but it doesn't matter. Because right now the people who vote, other than the people in this room, because I know all of you do, but the people who vote are the people who make a difference. And right now, that's the people who vote in the Republican primary. And it's a very small number relative to the number of registered voters that we have in our state, but that's who makes a difference. So we continue to see the fight to impact access to abortion care. And in this session, what that meant was changing the requirements for minors seeking abortion. So girls, teen girls who have been raped or who have had incest committed against them, have been assaulted, have more barriers they have to go around now if they want to have an abortion. We had a system in place that had been worked out on a bipartisan basis with the judiciary so that we had a system that required judicial intervention. It was a process that everybody agreed to. They made the process much harder, and it's going to be much more difficult for these girls now to access that service. That's a legal service for them. Tried to discriminate against the LGBT community in terms of preventing clerks from issuing marriage licenses and preventing LGBT folks from adopting. We were able to thwart all of that, thank goodness. But they did kick Planned Parenthood out of the breast and cervical cancer screening program, leaving about 3,000 or so women without the access to care that they had for that service. The guns. Somebody wrote that this is due to the limitless legislative clout of the gun interests, and I would say that's probably true. I cannot explain to you why this is happening. I cannot explain to you why this is such a big deal, but it apparently is, and it must have something to do with those interests and their ability to lobby for this, because it was a very big deal to the leadership of this legislative body and to many that were in it. So before this session, we've had a lot of people who've tried to have gun legislation, and it's been thwarted for a variety of maneuvering processes, including the two-thirds rule in the Senate, which was changed for the first time in, I don't know, decades this session. But as a result of it getting through with the makeup of the House and the Senate that we have now, open carry starts January 1 of 2016. So January 1 of 2016, we're going to go back to the wild, wild west here in Texas, and people are going to be able to walk down the street, walk into businesses, go anywhere pretty much that they want, if they have a concealed handgun license, with their gun in a holster. Okay? I, for one, am not looking forward to that day. But that is what's going to happen. And then, even worse in some ways, campus carry. This is just unbelievable to me. And I don't have, I have to tell you, I don't have a great explanation for how this ended up happening, because we had some maneuverings on the House floor that night that this could have gone a lot of different directions, and it went the wrong direction. The fact is that not only did we hear from all kinds of people on university campuses, students, faculty, parents, others, that they did not want this. We also heard most loudly from law enforcement that they did not want this. Now, I think the conservative legislative body that we have is typically one that is law and order and wants to respond to that, but not in this case. In this case, even that was not sufficient to get this political agenda through to appease this small group of people. And so the fact is that we will have campus carry beginning for our four-year institutions on August 1st of 2016, and for our community colleges on August 1st of 2017. The school leadership, campus leadership, has been given a little bit of leeway to determine some gun-free areas, but their hands are going to be pretty tied there. So looking ahead real quickly, let me just say we're going to be losing 14 of our House members, R's and D's, a lot of them with a long history of service. We're losing a lot of our committee chairs. We're losing the chairman of appropriations, the vice chairman of appropriations, the chairman of public education, the chairman of public health. Big changes that are going to be happening in the next legislative session. And the fact is that of my Republican colleagues that are leaving, most of them are my so-called mainstream Republican colleagues who at one time would have been called conservative and now are being labeled as rhinos and liberals. So we're concerned about their replacements making our legislative body even further to the right than it currently is. One of the final things I want to mention to you is Medicaid rate reduction, because that's been in the paper a lot recently. We've been really pushing that. It's a bipartisan effort, primarily being pushed, though, by the Democrats to say this got put in the budget at the very end. We didn't have a chance to really debate it. This is reducing the reimbursement rates for occupational, speech, and physical therapy for disabled children and adults, but it's primarily children that benefit from these services, children that have CP, children that have had brain injuries. 60,000 children are expected to be deprived of services due to this cut. I told you about the billions we still have available to us. This is a program that Texas is cutting $150 million plus $200 from the feds. $150 million state dollars when we have billions available to us, and depriving 60,000 Texas children who are disabled of services. It's unconscionable. Real quickly, too, we have interim charges that are coming up. Those will come out pretty soon. They'll dictate what happens during the interim. I encourage you to pay attention in whatever way you can. Go on our website or whatever and find out what those charges are. There will be committee hearings. You have an opportunity to testify to those. And in November, we'll have the 7 amendments that you can vote on, one of which will be an amendment for you to lower your homestead exemption for property taxes for our schools, and one which will have this very cockamamie scheme to fund transportation, which I can tell you about if you want to know. But I know I'm running out of time, but I'm supposed to talk and open it up to you. Thank y'all for having me. I look forward to your questions.
We have plenty of time. I think we have about 27 minutes or so for Q&A, which is great. We'll start with our first question. Crockett?
Yes, this is regarding that concealed gun carry on campus during the bill for that. I know on the state website I had put in twice. I wanted to testify before the House hearings on those, and in both cases, the information I put in just disappeared. I never had any chance to testify on that, and I mean, currently it's a very bad bill, and I just wanted to know how does one get to testify on things like this?
Well, I'm sorry you had that experience, and I don't know exactly what happened to you, but certainly I'll be glad to talk with you later about that to see if we can find out specifically. But you should be able to testify. You have to go to the Capitol and go to one of the kiosks set up there to actually sign up to testify in that manner. You can submit written testimony to the committee as well, but it won't necessarily be read. It won't necessarily by some be considered as the official testimony. But in order to testify right now, you have to physically go to the Capitol, which of course is very prohibitive for a lot of people, especially if you don't live here. I'm sorry? That's correct. That's correct. But we can talk, and I'm sorry? Anybody can testify. You don't have to convince anybody. Anybody has the right to testify unless it's invited only testimony, which happens sometimes. No public testimony, but otherwise anyone can show up. The different chairmen, chairwomen have discretion over how each of their committees is run. So some of them allow unlimited testimony. Some limit the amount of time. Some will have a cutoff period. We've made it very complicated, and we need to do a better job about that because it's your government. It's supposed to be you through us affecting what happens, and you have to have access to that, and there are a lot of barriers to it. So I'm sorry that you had that experience, and we need to do a better job.
Since I happen to have the microphone, I'm going to ask a question. Is there any growing momentum to try to develop a new system of public school finance, especially given Judge John Dietz's ruling?
Yeah, thank you. And I was trying to quickly go through things, so I think I did skirt over that. We did have the hearing before the Supreme Court on September 1st. We're waiting to hear back on that. I think most of us believe that the rendering is going to be that the current school finance system is unconstitutional. Whether or not that dictates that we will have a special session remains to be seen. The decision about a special session is pretty much going to be made based on the politics, surprise, surprise, of what's going on at the time. So not wanting to have legislators have to meet and make decisions prior to, say, the primary elections. That's not going to happen because they don't want to affect the outcome of those elections. But indeed, we will be dealing with that one way or another. The big issue here is how do we do this knowing that it's going to cost us more when we're looking more at tax cuts than at tax revenue streams. And that's still going to be a big challenge for us. It's going to cost us billions more to adequately fund public education. We have to find a way to do that, and that's going to be the big challenge.
We have a question from Richard Halpin.
Before my question, I just want to thank you for being such a terrific, committed, fair, balanced, and equitable leader for all of our community. Would you all give a round of applause?
Thank you.
So we've talked a lot about education, and I'm curious that the state has made promises to our teachers for decades. And how are we doing with keeping up with those promises to our teachers in terms of retirement and in terms of supporting them in their retirement and their health care?
We're doing good and bad. We made some efforts in the previous legislative session to address the shortcomings in the teacher retirement system. That's on a better footing than it was before. But the TRS care, for the health care for retirees in particular, and for active teachers, we have not found the will to invest in that appropriately, and there are a lot of challenges there. And I guess the biggest concern people have, of course, is how are we going to pay for that? Are we going to still keep taking that out of the pockets of our teachers, expecting them to pay more when our salaries are still too low to begin with? So those are still challenges that we're having to address. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there. So I would say that we're some good, some not so good, and some pretty bad in that area.
Okay. First, an observation: median price on new homes in Austin, $255,000, which is less than a lot of people seem to think it is, but still record high. Question: how do you keep your sanity?
Well, I come among friends like you. That helps. Having started this at an older age, I guess part of me is willing to work on things that I care about and feel like it's a real opportunity to have a bully pulpit to do that, and taking advantage of it while I can, and not looking to use this for something else has kind of freed me to approach it that way. But I tell you, this was one of the hardest sessions. This was a very hard session. There were a lot of things to pay attention to. We felt like we were burning whatever it is at both ends, and trying to just keep up with all of the issues going on, because there are so few of us relative to a larger group who are trying to make sure that we're focused on the things that really make a difference in the day-to-day lives of Texans. And so it's challenging sometimes, but I'm grateful for the opportunity.
My concern is related to energy, and right now San Antonio is reaching non-attainment because of the massive amount of pollution coming from the Eagle Ford Shale area, and it won't be long before it'll be in Austin because the southerly winds will bring it here. Yet the legislature doesn't seem to recognize the astronomical rates of asthma and other related illnesses. Is there any hope in the future to try to deal with the oil and gas industry not really paying for the damage that they're doing?
I would like to say there's some hope there, and maybe there is, but the sad thing that I have witnessed is that you mentioned asthma in particular. The body that we currently have and that we've had for several sessions that I've been there anyway is not really interested in scientific data that supports policy, not really keen on evidence-based practices. So we have seen this time and time again when we have physicians testifying about this very thing you mentioned about the health impacts, and that's disregarded. We have physicians and other healthcare providers testifying about the value of vaccinations. That's disregarded. We have all kinds of things that we hear about that's disregarded, and it's extremely disappointing. And we also have a body that wants to point its finger at the federal government for interfering with what happens here, and yet this state government does the exact same thing to the local jurisdictions, for instance, Denton and their fracking. The local community came together and said they did not want that. The state said, I'm sorry, we're the ones that are going to tell you, local people, what to do. The exact hypocritical kind of statement when that state body's pointing to the feds and saying, don't tell us about how to take care of the air here. We're doing just fine ourselves. It is a challenge, and it's a big issue. And Austin, as you say correctly so, is in line to perhaps be in non-attainment. That will cost us in dollars. That will cost us in health care. And we're trying to do what we can to address it, but it is a very high hill to climb in that legislative body.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the consolidation of health and human services agencies. Where are we? Is it still looking like it may happen? I'm actually a strong opponent of it. Where are we going on that? Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact number from before when the consolidation occurred, like in 2003, I guess it was. There were like 15 agencies, I think, that got reduced to 5. And then now what's come out of this session is combining some of those that will have, I think, 3 different... to tell you the truth, this is one of those things that got very complicated because it was derailed by legislators who wanted to insert abortion-related legislation into this, and it shut down the whole sunset review system at one point. They've scaled back what they're going to do with the consolidation, so I have to look into it to tell you exactly what's happening now, but I can tell you that within women's health care, for instance, there were 3 programs that are going to now be 2 programs. That's just within the major agencies. So there's going to be an oversight committee that's being created by the legislature to look at the overall consolidation going on as well to ensure that services are going to continue to be provided in an appropriate way. But it remains to be seen how that's going to happen. And with what happened this last go around with the contracts that were let through HHSC, it was already a very big agency that people were concerned that had some impact on how these things were slipping through inappropriately. Now it's going to be even bigger. So I don't know. We'll have to be paying attention to that.
You're going to hold the mic. All right. I'm confused. And that's because I don't know what context to put in the criminal charges against the governor and the attorney general. I find it, I'm hoping it's good for our side, but I just don't know how to have a context for it.
Well, I think what I would say, particularly about the attorney general, is that when you say good for our side, I don't think it's good for Texas or Texans, no matter what side you might be on, to have the lead attorney of your state under indictment, under the kinds of legal challenges that he has, and he's already admitted culpability to some extent in some of this. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm hesitant to address it too specifically. I think it's disappointing, and I think it's detrimental to the effectiveness of that office and the credibility that office holds. In terms, you mentioned the governor as well. We'll see where that goes. I mean, that's going to be an ongoing struggle here with the governor and the people that are working with him. And now that he's withdrawn from the presidential election, I don't know how that's going to impact that. I don't know what kind of investment there will be in that now. But Governor Perry was really good at wielding power. He brought more and more power into a weak governor position and was able to use that to launch his
presidential campaign the last time and this time. I would suggest, even though I think the governor did, there were a few things I worked with him on that I was pleased about. I think that he kind of sold us a bill of goods there and threw us under the bus in order to set up his national platform. That's why some of that money was not invested in public education when we had it to do so that he could go on the trail and say, in his opinion, we kept basic services, but we ended up cutting and still had money in the bank, and that was something he was very proud of. It left our students shorthanded, though.
Going back to needing to go physically to the Capitol to testify, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a person with disabilities, and I believe that's a violation of the ADA. And do you have a recommendation for how to perhaps try to change that from going at it from that angle? Would a legal action need to be taken? Do I write a letter to someone? How do I begin?
Very interesting question, and I don't know the actual response to that, but I would say that I would love to talk with you about that and figure out what we can do here. Accommodations are made for people to come, but you're suggesting that there should be an additional accommodation that doesn't require physical presence. And I think that's something that we should be looking at, absolutely. So thank you for bringing that up, and I will look at that.
Thank you. My name is Laura Wood. And what can you tell us about the current requirements for children to be vaccinated before entering the public school system?
Well, right now, it is required that children be vaccinated, but there are exceptions that are medical exceptions, but also exceptions for conscience and religious beliefs. What was attempted this session was to, what we thought, take advantage synergistically of some of what's been going on with some epidemics in our country, where people recognized how this was jeopardizing the health and well-being of our communities, to tighten up the exemptions and make them focus more on the real medical exemptions, but diminish those opportunities at getting the exemptions for conscience and belief. That didn't happen. We weren't able to even get hearings on those bills. The people that are chairmen or chairwomen of their committees are the gatekeepers for what kind of legislation can even get a hearing on their committees, and we could not get a hearing on that legislation. So there were a variety of ways that were being addressed, from just providing education all the way to actually having a mandate that said you will have it unless you have a medical exemption. But none of that got anywhere. So we're still with the same regulations that we've had in place, which are that you have to have vaccinations to enter our public schools unless you have those exemptions.
I'm trying to take questions in the order that people raise their hands, so bear with me, please. Would you stand and say your name?
Yeah, my name's Joanne Richards. The governor had an emergency item of ethics reform, and it seems to me that that was an opportunity that was missed. Would you like to comment on what happened?
Yeah, it's interesting because typically, if the governor at the beginning of the session gives a list, if you will, of emergency items that can be taken ahead of time before the calendar allows us to consider things, but also means that it's something that the governor is interested in seeing passing and will hopefully be a partner in getting it through rather than getting in the way of it. And ethics reform was included in that, and we hardly got anything done with ethics reform. It was sabotaged in a lot of different ways. I will say primarily on the Senate side. There's always this battle between the House and the Senate, but there were a lot of pieces of legislation that were going to strengthen reporting requirements, disclosures, all kinds of things. The double dipping passed. That was one thing, so that did pass. But none of the major stuff passed. The dark money didn't pass. So we continued. In fact, some ways we made some of the legislation worse. But the issue is for legislators, we like to talk a lot about ethics reform and saying it's important and needed so that we have your trust and confidence in what we're doing. But when push comes to shove, it's very hard to get any of that passed. And it's very unfortunate because this is not about gotcha, in my opinion. This is about saying you have a right to know information about any potential conflicts of interest, and then you get to make the decision as a voter about whether or not you want to support that person. If it's not a conflict for you, go ahead and vote for them. But you need the information to make that decision, and we don't give it to you. So it was very unfortunate.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer. Douglas?
Donna, next year is a presidential election year, and there are a number of progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders that seem to be generating a large amount of excitement and enthusiasm. Do you believe there's any chance of a significant pickup in representatives in Texas in the coming years because of this?
It is exciting, and we all of us that around and involved with the previous election with Barack Obama know that was also huge and got a lot of people out that weren't voters before, and hopefully that'll be happening again this time, and we will see an increased turnout. The fact is, as I mentioned earlier, most people don't vote, and that really is a problem. Certainly they don't vote in the primaries and then turn out more for the general elections, especially in the presidential year, but we still don't have the kind of turnout we need. Anything we can do to increase that, I think, is to the good. In terms of how it's going to impact our elections, I also mentioned redistricting a while ago, and the simple fact is that we do not have many competitive races from which you can choose. So there probably won't be any significant changes. We're waiting on a court case that's looking at the redistricting that may affect some of our boundaries and could, in fact, affect some of the elections coming up. So in terms of being a Democrat, there's the potential for having some more competitive districts that Democrats could maybe actually win. But we haven't gotten the rendering from the judges yet on that, so we still don't know what that's going to be. Right now, as I said, most of the districts are not competitive. There's only a handful that are. The biggest competition going on in the House right now is on the Republican side, and it's in their primary, where you basically have people who are of the very limited shrink government so you can drown it in a bathtub mentality against your so-called mainstream Republicans. That's where the big battles are right now, and that's what's really making a difference. I don't know about on the national level that we're going to see that impact these other races, at least in the upcoming election.
We have a question from Lisa LeBlanc.
I was wondering, with the gun laws changing and everybody realizes it's a big mistake, what will happen to rescind these laws? I mean, with the legislature, what can happen? Will a special session have to be called, or just what can happen?
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but a lot of people do care about that, but the people that matter want to keep the laws the way they are and make them even stronger. We're not going to rescind anything in the near future. That's not going to happen because we're still working under those that are voting in the primaries, and their agenda is to have this go as far as they can. And so there's already disappointment out there that the leadership of the higher education institutions have any say whatsoever. There's several states like Utah, I think it is, where the schools have no say over it. They have to have guns, and they don't have any option to limit the guns on their campus. The fact that we've given the authority to limit access in some parts of campus is totally opposite of what some of these folks want, who do have the power over the agenda right now. So if anything happens, it's going to get worse, in my opinion. And we're certainly not going to have a special session over this, certainly not to rescind anything. This is the direction that we're going because the people that have been elected are the ones that are setting this agenda, and they're elected by that small group of people. Until we have enough people who get out there and vote and say we want a different agenda, it is not going to change.
We have 5 minutes left, and a question from Felicia.
I wanted to make sure you mentioned two things in the fall election, one about education funding, but the other, you used the term cockamamie and transportation.
Sorry.
So if you could...
Not a very scientific term.
I'm very interested in cockamamie. So if you could tell us about that.
Yes, there is a constitutional amendment that you're going to be asked to vote on that has to do with funding transportation. And it's a complicated one, so I'm going to look at it so I'll remember. I think I'm going to look at it if I see it here to tell you exactly. But basically, it's looking at the amount of sales tax coming in right now and saying if you get above that, which is about, I think, $28 million is what I want to say per year. Yeah, okay. Whatever comes in above that, a percentage will go to fund transportation. And the same thing with vehicle sales. A percentage above the amount that's currently coming in for vehicle sales will go to transportation. So the idea is this is money that we haven't not already spent or appropriated, so let's go ahead and set that aside and dedicate that to transportation. What that does on the so-called negative end is it's saying you're going to grow everything like your health care needs, your education needs, and all these other things, but you're going to take away some of your money that would be coming in to pay for those things and dedicating them to transportation. But it's all we have right now, and if you add up all the things that we've put together to pay for transportation through the recent constitutional amendments and so forth, it still doesn't get us where we need to go. But right now we don't have money coming in that we need for transportation to maintain the current system that we have, certainly not to build more. And I'm talking even multimodal. We just don't have it. And so I am going to be supporting that constitutional amendment. I'm supporting all of them except supporting all of them, but some of them are like, one of them is to say you have the right to hunt and fish. Come on. Were y'all threatened about that? No. It was somebody we have the right to hunt and fish because it sounded good when they go out campaigning that they got that constitutional amendment. You can go hunt and fish now. Really. But we're going to have a constitutional amendment you get to vote on that says you have that right. Maybe we should have one that says you have the right to vote.
I hope we didn't miss any questions, but I want to thank you, Donna, for trying to make the activities of our Texas State Legislature more comprehensible to us. And again, we appreciate your sharing your time with us on a Sunday at noon. And please keep representing us the way you have. And thanks again.
Thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.